Okay. And then we should have a transcript. Are you able to see transcript of me talking right now, everyone? Anyone?
I can see it.
You can see it? Okay, so that's
Yeah.
working.
No, I
No.
don't think so.
Yeah, I can't see it either.
You can't see it at the bottom of your screen?
I can't see it as well.
No, I don't.
It says live transcription, closed captioning has been enabled, right?
Yeah. It looks like it's all enabled on my end, but I don't know if there's something you might have to choose on your side. And as you're coming in, everyone, if you put your volume on mute, please. Thank you. Okay, still have a few more people arriving. So Violeta, what is in posole? It's corn based, yes?
Mostly pozole. It's a pre-Hispanic dish. So it used to be, I mean, according to legend, I couldn't like certify what I'm saying, but according to legend, it was a ceremonial dish that used to be prepared with human meat.
Oh,
Okay,
nice.
so that's legend, but it's mostly it's a broth with
Oh, I can see the
chile, with pork, with corn, and it's a specific kind of corn because it's a really big kind of corn.
It's hominy, right?
Yes, yes. So it's basically a really concentrated broth, pork broth with corn and pork, and you put lettuce on it, you put rábano, which is radish, on it, and oregano, and it's really good.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I could describe it justly.
I imagine
really
every
good.
family has their own recipe passed down generations from
Possibly, yes.
grandma to grandma, right? Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I eat the one my neighbor makes. My grandmother didn't really make pozole, but but I'm sure there's a lot of, yeah, there's different recipes. There's I mean, the one I'm speaking of, which is red pozole, is done in the center of Mexico, but there's also green pozole, there's also white pozole, which is more of the Morelos area. The green pozole is more of the Guerrero area. So it's different kinds of pozole. It really depends on the kind of tomato and the kind of chile you're using.
Oh, wow. Okay, everybody, raise your hand if you are hungry now for pozole.
Yeah.
I just
it's really
ate.
good.
And
I hope you all get to.
transcript.
I hope you all get to try it someday, and I'm sure you will, because you're all in California, right?
Yes,
So
Sacramento.
there's
Yes.
a big community, a big Mexican community there. I'm sure there's some way to get pozole.
Well, welcome everyone to our second lecture tonight with Violeta Romo Norquist, and she's going to talk a little bit about the composer Chavez and some of the things about the Mexican Revolution. I wanted to read her bio to you, and there'll be some time at the end of our lecture tonight to ask some questions, or maybe even as we're going on. Please feel free to use the chat and type anything in there as we go along. Already we've had a nice discussion about posole. So let's keep that going because it makes it a lot more fun for everyone. So this is the bio that we have on our site, and let me read it in case you haven't seen it yet. Violeta Romo received her BA in history from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and an MA in modern and contemporary history from the Morta Research Institute in Mexico City, where she is currently enrolled as a PhD student. She's taught history courses in public and private schools and universities. She's participated in multiple research projects and published articles on historiography, history of music, and history of education in specialized magazines and books. She is currently doing research for her doctoral dissertation on the history of motherhood and family planning in Mexico during the 20th century. And so before we start, I wanted to ask you about that. Tell us a little bit about your dissertation.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm currently doing research on how modern motherhood was constructed in Mexico during the last quarter of the 20th century, particularly through the advice that was given to women through magazines and child raising manuals. So I am trying to see how that created certain archetypes of what being a mother meant, and also how there was a connection between Mexican motherhood and cosmopolitan motherhood, as in what other countries had to say about what being a mother meant. So that's what I'm currently doing. It doesn't really have to do much with Chavez, but that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's very interesting, though, right?
Yeah.
Would think that there could be some connections there, particularly in the way he was raised. Well, last time we talked a bit about nationalism and music and what that means. And I briefly spoke about Carlos Chavez, about his relationship with Aaron Copland, because both of those composers were looking for their own nationalistic sound, right? And these kinds of things, when composers and artists are incorporating national elements, a lot of times come about through events that spark that kind of creativity. And so I wondered if maybe, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of you on what you wanted to talk about, but I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about the nationalism in Mexico, the revolution, what the influence was on Chavez and all of that.
Sure. Well, that is actually a really big part of what I want to speak about today, because Chavez, I think his particularity and his importance comes because he is a man of the revolution, and he is one of these, not only a musician but also like a politician who thrived with revolution in Mexico. So he was born in 1899. So that means he was literally a man from the turn of the century. And he grew up during revolution. For those of you who don't know, Mexican Revolution started in 1910, and it was this big movement from proletarian and peasants against the Porfirista regime, which was mostly favoring and benefiting high classes and the bourgeois. So Carlos Chavez came from that environment, and he was from a well-established family, which meant he was not necessarily part of the proletarian class, but he, as many men of that era, grew into this need to redefine what being a Mexican meant, and particularly what this new nation that was being born after the revolution meant.
Could you tell us a little bit about what happened to the revolution? Because I think that's a really interesting story and how that all comes about.
Yeah, sure. there's actually a lot of contradictions during the revolution. So when we think of the revolution, it's usually like this big fight between people and the government. But it's actually more complex than that, because it began with, well, to start with, it was the end of this really long era with one dictatorship, which was Porfirio Diaz, and people who were fed up by this dictatorship. So a lot of politicians from the middle class were ready to have a change in the government. But there was also a lot of discomfort among peasants and among proletarians, you know, like factory workers and mine workers, because their rights and their rights were being stepped on. So the revolution began in 1910, literally at 6 p.m., 20th of November, because some of these groups were getting ready to go against Porfirio Diaz. I don't know how much in detail you want me to go into here, because there was a lot of details, but well, Porfirio Diaz was really old. He was in his 80s, and he was giving hints that he was ready to retire. So a lot of people were hopeful to have a change because he was going to retire. But then there was a big election, a big presidential election, because even though it was a dictatorship, there were elections that were always won by him.
Yeah.
So it was more of a simulation. There was this big election where everybody thought he was going to be ready to retire, but he didn't. So
No.
that's when these groups, these political
that's-
groups of the middle classes decided to begin a movement
I
against
see.
him.
And that's where you get these characters like Pancho Villa, right? Who
Yeah.
organized and sort of fought for the lower class, I guess, or the proletariat,
Yes.
as you would describe, and were and then became these actually big figures on their own. Who was the other? Orozco, I think.
So yeah, that's where it gets really messy, actually, because the first person I would like to speak of, I mean, if it comes to the revolution, is Francisco I. Madero. He was a middle-class politician who belonged to a well-established family in the north, and he wanted to go against Porfirio Diaz in the election, and he was incarcerated by Diaz. So that's when he decided to put out a plan where he said, okay, we are going to overthrow the government the 20th of November at 6 p.m.
Yeah.
And it was very specific. It's not like people were actually going to go out at 6 p.m. and overthrow the government, but it really did move people.
Right.
And
but he was executed later, right? The
he was, so he actually did overthrow Diaz. Diaz decided to resign and leave the country.
Yeah.
And he became the president, but then he was overthrown by Victoriano Huerta, who we could say he is like the only real villain in this story, because he really wasn't fighting for anyone but himself and the military. So he was overthrown, and at the same time, there were different movements, because Mexico, you have to think about Mexico as a really big country. I mean, the United States is a really big country, and you can definitely say that California is not the same as Maine or as Tennessee. So the same thing happens with Mexico. Mexico is a really big country, and there's different kind of economic activities, and there's different kind of ideologies, and that's what happened during the revolution. So Madero was a middle-class politician, and then we have Zapata, who is in the south of the country, who was more of a rural fighter, because he was fighting against big land ownership and he was fighting for the rights over land ownership.
Mm.
And
So
then
you
we have
have-
Pancho Villa at the north, who was more of a, well, he was definitely a bandit, but he was also fighting for also land ownership, and mostly people who didn't actually have land or didn't actually have anything. So he was fighting for people who didn't have anything.
Yeah.
It
So
was-
you have this rising up. Then you have this rising up of the
we have all
the-
this
of the
happening.
class, and this influencing artists, right? And artists are starting to use elements that are indigenous in their mediums, whatever those might be. Maybe they're a
This-
painter.
Yeah, this situation, the revolution, was revolutionary. I mean, it sounds kind of dumb when I say it like that, but it's revolutionary. So it was this big this big change in Mexico, not only political change, but it was also a cultural change, because that meant that the governments that followed the revolution wanted to start over, like leave everything that had been culture and everything that had been art behind, and create new art and create a new national identity. And that's where we can start detecting the Mexican revolutionary national identity after the revolution. And it's a very different national identity to what artists during Porfirio Diaz regime, or even before, in this actually kind of new country, because it was born in 1810, was founded on.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting because revolutions have produced this around the world, and the arts are mirror it, and this is really interesting to see this happening, and particularly I'm sure there were influences from World War One and all of that, and here you have this movement in Mexico, and so you have people who come forward like Chavez, and who becomes and maybe you can tell us, but maybe the father of the nationalistic style and classical music in Mexico.
Yeah, Carlos Chavez is a very interesting character, because, well, during the revolution, he was a teenager. The revolution began in 1910 and it finished around 1920. And it finished with a lot of loose ends. So it wasn't like the revolution finished and the country was born. It was a very very difficult situation, a very divisive situation for Mexicans. But Chavez, during his teenagehood, he began to manifest a lot of his thought about what Mexican music and Mexican culture was supposed to be. And he actually worked quite close to the revolutionary governments, because when he was around 16 years old, he and a lot of his friends, including very important poets for Mexican literature, scientists, and he had really important friends that were his friends during high school, and they began this magazine that was founded by the revolutionary government called Gladios. And that's where we can begin to see Chavez evolution as a composer, but also as an ideologist for the revolution, because he, with his friends, started to manifest the necessity of a Mexican school of composition and a Mexican sound. They were actually questioning, what does Mexico sound like, and what does Mexico mean? Because, and that's a question we should all have regarding our countries. What does being an American mean? What does being a Mexican mean? And that's a question they were asking in the middle of this war and in the middle of this very agitated time for both for culture and politics.
And so what did Chavez do as far as training and all of that, and how did he find that sound? What elements did he bring into his music?
Well, his training was not very different to what any other musician's training would have been. back then. So he became an orphan quite young. His father died, and he and his 6 brothers and sisters had to support their family, their mother and all the small children. And his older siblings, particularly his brother Manuel, started teaching him piano, because knowing piano was a very important part of the high class families back then. So he started learning piano, and he had he was his first music teacher. He learned a little bit of piano, a little bit of music theory, and then he continued his studies with a local pianist called Asuncion Parra. And then when he was around 11 or 12 years old, he began studying with Manuel M. Ponce, who I don't know if he's very known in the United States, but he's one of the very important Mexican composers from the 20th century. And he's actually quite a big influence in Chávez, because he was one of these composers who was trying to translate popular music, maybe not folkloric or indigenous, but he was already starting to translate popular music into concert hall music, which would then become a trademark for Chávez. So Manuel M. Ponce was one of his very important teachers. Also Pedro Luis Ogazon, who was a very distinguished pianist from the era. And he, one thing that he would say later on was that he refused to have a composition teacher. He didn't really want to be limited by someone who would teach him composition. So he would study composition on his own by studying the great composers, Beethoven, and he was a big admirer of Beethoven, but he, basically any composer who was important back then,
But didn't he go to Europe for a while to study? I think.
Yes.
I was trying to remember, and I know he had some connections. Of course, we talked about his connection to Copland, but in the United States too.
Yes. So in 1915, he was only 15, 16 years old. Manuel M. Ponce left the country. His big teacher, he left to Cuba, possibly because of the revolution. And he began studying with other pianists. And he continued his adolescence studying this way. But in the 1920s, already close to the government, he was able to visit both Europe and the United States. And that was crucial for his upbringing, because he had a lot of influence from what was going on in Europe and what was going on in the United States. He as a young man, he truly believed that national music had been undervalued and needed to be appreciated and promoted. And that was very similar to what was happening in other countries. Nationalism was really, it was a trend during these years. We can talk about nationalism in Mexican music. We can talk about nationalism in Russian music. It was a trend, because most countries were trying to define what being a nation, a modern nation, more than anything meant. So when he traveled to Europe and when he traveled to the United States, he became friends with composers who were also experimenting with these sounds. The most notable example would be Stravinsky in Russia, and of course Aaron Copland in the United States.
Yeah, and was Chavez part of that group and that ended up in Paris and all of that, or I can't remember where he went to in Europe, but there was I think Diego Rivera was there and Stravinsky was there, and I know Copland was there.
He actually went to Europe a little bit later. Diego Rivera went with a scholarship from the government around 1915.
Okay.
And his time in Paris is actually quite interesting, because it's not very similar to what we know of him. if you think of Diego Rivera, you think of these big murals that are very Mexican and that represent the Mexican Revolution and the independence and the proletarian force and all that.
Yeah.
But during his time in Paris, he was actually studying Cubism, and he has a lot of portraits that are Cubists. So it was a different era for Diego Rivera, and Carlos Chavez actually went around 6 years later,
Oh,
1920s.
yeah. So when Chavez gets back to, well, and possibly he was working on Mexican sound when he was traveling too, but when he, as he's putting that all together, where is he drawing his influences from?
That's a part that is really interesting because okay, so Chavez was against drawing influence from European music. So he did not like Impressionist music. He did not like Italian influence. He did not like French influences. He thought that Mexico needed a new sound, and a sound that was properly Mexican, which didn't mean he would become this island completely free from European influence, but he was trying to integrate indigenous sounds into concert hall music, which is mostly Western. And what's interesting about that is that he took a lot of influence from sounds that were recollected by ethnographers during the first years of the century. And this is actually not only related to history of music, but also history of anthropology and ethnography. During the first 10 years of the century, we can speak of the first anthropologists and the first ethnographers. And there was this German ethnographer who came to Mexico, and he studied the sounds and the music of the Yaquis and the cities and these tribes in the north of Mexico. And that's where Chavez drew a lot of inspiration from these sounds that were indigenous, or supposedly indigenous, because they actually were quite Western. They weren't really that indigenous. And he tried to integrate those sounds into Western music.
Now, how would you describe Yaqui sounds? Were these dances? Were they folk songs, like lullabies? What kind of music was he looking at?
Mostly dances. If you think about the north of Mexico, the first thing that would come, I mean, if you're asking a person raised in Mexico, the first thing that would come to mind is these dances where they're dressed as deer or as, and they're, it's dances mostly. Actually, if I can play something right now, I'd like to play one of these dances. So one of his first, okay, just to clear this, he drew a lot of inspiration from this, but at that beginning, his first compositions weren't really that indigenous. They were mostly modernist and futuristic, and it was when he began to be related to the International Composers Guild, where he met Aaron Copland and all these foreign composers, when he actually began to be really into indigenous sounds, because that's what other composers applauded for him. They thought, okay, this is really new and this is really interesting. So that's when he started to exploit that sound. But these sounds are mostly, they're mostly dances, and they're very rhythmic. He was very interested in having a very rhythmic sound that distinguished Mexican music from French music or German music or Italian music, which was what sounded mostly in concert halls during the 19th century in Mexico. So if I can, I am going to share the Sinfonia India, which is probably his most known composition. Let me know if you can hear it. All right, so
That's super cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, you hear a lot of 20th century elements in there, like you hear Stravinsky's influence in that,
Definitely.
and you hear if you're familiar with the sound of Copland, you hear that openness of his sound in there too. But yeah, there's something else, right? And
there was a really big dialogue between Chavez and Copeland.
yeah.
They had a really collaborative friendship, and they, I mean, Copeland came many times to Mexico, and Chavez went many times to the United States, and they drew inspiration from each other.
Yeah.
But this is a very interesting symphony, because it tries to create a Mexican sound based on what indigenous sounds were, according to ethnographers. Not really, I mean, we can't really say there's a pure indigenous sound, because it's the 20th century. There's already enough dialogue between the Western world and the indigenous tribes. So this is what they thought back then was pure indigenous sound.
Yeah. So these are based, you said on Yaqui indigenous sounds, right? And is there a relationship between Aztecs and the Yaqui, or are they completely different?
Well, Aztecs is a really interesting situation, because there's no, I mean, yeah, the Aztec culture is the most known culture, but there's not really a relation. It's the pre-Hispanic cultures were very different in the center of the country, Mesoamerica, to the north, and Yaquis were from the north. The north was a very difficult area to conquer, which is why it was mostly left alone, and that's why it was so easy to take over by the Americans, you know, Texas and all that. But there's not really a relationship, and we can't really know what Aztec music sounded like. We have an idea, but it's impossible to know.
Yeah. What do you think?
Most of the indigenous music we believe to be indigenous music is actually a 20th century construction. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of cultures too, I think.
Yeah.
Well, why do you think that Chavez was so interested in this particular group of music and
Yeah.
sound?
Well, Chavez, as a young man, when he was growing up and 16 years old and starting to write about what he believed Mexican music should be, he truly believed that national music had been undervalued and needed to be appreciated and promoted. And I mean, this was partially true because during the 19th century, Italian and French music had been favored. It had become the norm, not only in Mexico, but in all the world. And I mean, think of Verdi and Bizet and all the big composers of the 19th century. So artists looked towards Europe in search of artistic models, and there was this divisive correlation that implied that European art was high culture and Mexican art, thinking of popular, folkloric, or traditional art, was low culture. But for Chavez, it was really important to draw inspiration from this popular and folkloric or traditional art. And after the revolution, it was not only in music that this was this inspiration was drawn from. It was also in pictorial arts. It was also in theater. It was also in literature. And for Chavez, it was important to draw inspiration from the indigenous cultures, because that meant he was appreciating and also translating this actually Mexican, I mean, I quote Marx because what is actually Mexican, but you know, this actually Mexican sound was being favored against the European sound that was trying to be left behind. So that's why it was very important for Chavez, and not only Chavez, but also Diego Rivera, also Frida Kahlo, also all these artists from the post-revolutionary era. It was really important to look towards the indigenous arts.
So as we get into like the 1920s and 1930s, I'm assuming like Chavez is on the rise. Everybody is probably following his lead or thinking about trying to find the sound and all of that. And I know that he has some pretty big appointments in Mexico City, right? But also you had mentioned that he gets involved in politics.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, he has a lot of musical merit, a lot of artistic merit, but his biggest merit in Mexico, and it's the one that Mexicans eat and breathe and see every day, is his politics and his institutional legacy. Because he really did get involved into politics. He started creating relationships with high-level politicians from the beginning of the 1920s to the rest of his life. And also by getting involved in foreign institutions such as the Composers Guild, he somehow became the ambassador of Mexican music and the ambassador of Mexican culture. You know, he had big exhibits in the MoMA, and his music was played on the American radio and the European radio. And for politicians, that was important because he was placing Mexico in the international scene. He was then very valued by the government, and he was also very supported by the artistic community in the 1920s, 1930s. So he was the founder of the Mexican National Symphony, which still exists. And he was also appointed as the chair of the National Conservatory. That gave him a lot of power. A lot of power, because that meant he would then become the decision maker of Mexican arts and Mexican music. What was valued as music, what was valued as arts would go through him. So he was a very important character in Mexican politics. He then, in the 1940s, he was also really good friends with Miguel Alemán, who was the first civil president after the revolution. They had all been military. Then in 1946, we have Miguel Alemán, who was the first civil president, and he helped him and supported him during his campaign, and he helped him create the National Fine Arts Institute, which to this date is the institution that controls and also allows the existence of government-supported arts. So that's a very big deal. He was a very important part of the construction of institutions, cultural institutions, in this post-revolutionary period, where the country was defining and establishing what it meant to be Mexico, what it was Mexico.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Mexico City, the National Symphony.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So where did they perform in the city? Do they have their own concert hall or?
Yeah. Yeah, they began performing all around. They would go to small towns because part of the revolutionary discourse was that they were trying to educate the masses. So the symphony would go to small towns and try to take high culture and high cultural music into small towns. But in 1934, the Palacio de Bellas Artes was open to the public. And since then, that's been their home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if you come to Mexico City and want to go to a classical music concert, Bellas Artes is the main place to go to.
Oh, I see. I didn't know there was a concert hall there. I thought it was just visual arts and everything. So that's very interesting.
No, it's a beautiful concert hall. It actually has this really beautiful. Oh gosh, I can't think of the word in English, but really beautiful. Okay, so sorry, what is this called? Like this on the window? Curtain. It has this really beautiful glass curtain. It has a really beautiful glass curtain made by Tiffany's. It has the volcanoes.
Wow, cool.
See what it's really a beautiful place to go to if you're ever in Mexico. I definitely recommend to visit.
We will all have to come and check it out. So I imagine the symphony is there and probably the ballet performs there. Yeah. And then is there a national opera as well there?
Yeah, the National Opera, the National Symphony, the National Theater, everything is there, which is a good thing. And it's also a bad thing because it means that most culture was centralized into Mexico City.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Chavez, I'm assuming, had a lot of influence on students, and there were probably composers that came after him that studied with him and have carried on what he established.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's actually another thing I would like to touch on, because he, as a director, as the chair of the conservatory, he created a Mexican composition workshop, and his students went to become the important composers in the years to come. So I mean, he had that advantage not only because he was a politician, but also because he did have a charisma and a lot of influence in students who would carry on this Mexican school of composition, where indigenous sounds and popular music were translated into concert hall music. I would actually like to play something that is very posterior to Chavez, but that I believe is a great example of this, because it's a high culture version of what is played in other areas of the country as popular music. It's the Huapango and the Danzón de Marquez. So it's actually two songs, if I could play them.
Yeah, I know these.
Yeah, they're actually kind of considered, I mean, the second national hymns in Mexico.
Oh yeah.
I'll play just small parts of this. So that's the huapango, and you'll probably hear the actual huapango in a few days when you hear, I think, Ursula talk about
Yeah,
huapango, but this is a concert hall version. And Moncayo was a close friend of Chavez, and then he was also a professor at the conservatory, and he was very influential. And this song is basically the second Mexican national hymn.
yeah,
But
I
then
love
we
that.
have,
Huapanco is a particular dance, right?
yes, it's
Yeah,
a particular dance from La Huasteca, and it has its particularities, and it's very traditional of a certain area, which is what these composers do. They take certain types of music of different areas and turn it into classical music or concert hall music.
yeah.
So that's what we have with the Huapango de Moncayo, which is very famous. And then years later, and this is a much younger composer because he was born in the 1940s, 1950s. So he's much younger than Chavez, but we have the danzón #2. And the danzón is also a type of dance that you will, if you come to Mexico, you will see old people dancing. It's a very slow and very, I would even dare to say, very sexual dance. And it's very popular. It's what's played in dance salons, such as Salon Mexico, like here in
Yeah.
Cleveland.
It's
Salon.
pretty,
So,
it's a very intricate dance too, isn't it? I mean, there are
yeah.
like a lot of things to know. And I watched some danzón and I couldn't figure out like the pattern or anything. It was really,
Yeah, it's supposed to be very simple because you're dancing on a square, but it's very difficult to figure out, especially if I don't know, if you're born with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not born to dance, so I can't figure it out, but but it is a very, very intricate dance. So here's an example of how it was translated, and now it's in Cerveza Corona commercials, and
Oh.
it's also a very Mexican song. So here it goes. So
Yeah.
it's music that draws inspiration from popular music. And I believe that is one of the biggest, besides all the political legacy, but one of the biggest legacy of not only Chavez, but also Silvestre Revueltas and Moncayo and all these composers that were trying to translate popular music into concert hall music. It was making music that sounded like Mexico.
Yeah.
Answering that question, what does
Yeah.
Mexico sound like?
Wow, boy, yeah, I love those examples. That's great. And then that dance song too. You guys have to listen to that. That's just a
Yeah.
wonderful piece of music. And that tempo that it's in there in the beginning, it's very slow, but very soon it just takes off. It goes,
Oh,
like
yeah.
lightning. Yeah, yeah.
It becomes violent and
Yes, it's
exciting.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
What a great lecture. Thank you so much. Very very nice to hear all of that from you. And does anybody have any questions? You can put them up in chat, or you can come on and take yourself off mute. Oh, but before we do, Violeta, I was going to ask you, what is your favorite dessert?
Oh. Well, my favorite Mexican dessert is, oof. I don't really know. Sorry.
Doesn't have to be Mexican.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to. I'm half Midwestern, so I really love rhubarb pie. But
Okay, that
yeah,
sounds
I
perfect.
guess rhubarb pie.
I love it.
Yeah.
The key word for tonight's lecture is rhubarb pie. Again, rhubarb pie. If you don't know how to spell it, that's an easy Google.
Well, if we go Mexican, I'd like to say natilla, but it's more Spanish than Mexican. But a lot of Mexican desserts and dishes are Spanish, so.
Okay, well, I'll accept either
Natilla.
one. Natilla. You want to describe natilla for us? Because I'm.
It's a very thick eggnog. It's like eggnog, but very thick.
Yeah, and where do you get that? Do you like at a ice cream place or?
No, mostly in traditional Mexican restaurants or Spanish restaurants. The most easy place to get natilla is probably Sanborns, which is like our most common Mexican. It's like a Mexican diner. It's a chain.
What's the name of it?
What's that?
What was the name of the?
Sanborns.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll write in chat. Yeah, let me see. Chat.
I'll have to remember that so I can check it out. Very nice. Questions from anyone tonight? We have just a couple of minutes left, but you'll have this opportunity.
I had a quick question, actually. I know earlier you stated that he was an orphan, and I heard that he lost his dad at like 7, but I didn't hear when he lost his mom or if he didn't lose his mom.
Oh, he didn't. He was an orphan because of his dad, but he actually had his mother. And considering the time, that meant that he would have to take over a lot of the economical activities for his family. Something that's actually interesting about Carlos Chavez is that his musical activities not only started as he didn't jump from being a kid and then an orchestra conductor. He actually started being a pianist for Cinema Olympia, which is a movie theater in Mexico City, and he would musicalize silent films.
Yeah.
So he was an orphan on his dad's side, but he still had his mother.
Yeah, so many of the great composers got from that era got their start that way, right? Just accompanying silent film and sort of improvising underneath whatever was going on.
Yeah.
And what a great way to hone your craft, right?
You need a lot of ability to be able to improvise. I mean, I'm not a musician, so I believe that's a lot of skill.
So do you know anything about Chavez's mother?
No, I know his family had links with politicians, and that allowed him to, he did grow up in privilege, so that allowed him to have a lot of links with important people later on, like Jose Vasconcelos, who was a Secretary of Education, and his own friends when he was a teenager, like Carlos Pellicer and Luis Enrique Erro, and important Mexican personalities.
One more. Do we have one more question? Anybody? My Zoom is doing all kinds of weird things, so I see maybe 3 people. I think there's probably more people out there. But... No, huh? Well, all right then. Please.
I'd like to know about your research. When you're done with your motherhood research, that'd be awesome. So how would we be able to, read that?
Oh, well, I'd love to share that with you. Well, once I'm done with my dissertation, it will definitely be up on the Instituto Mora webpage.
That's the university that you attend. And could you put that in the chat?
Sure. It's if you search for it in Google, you'll be able to find it. And my master's degree dissertation is already there. It's in Spanish, but Google Translate does a really good job.
Mhm. I have a dictionary too.
Great. Yeah. So I'm sure you'll be able to read it. I'm a big believer in Google Translate. I think it works great. So yeah. And I'll also be speaking about my research in, well, it's in March. Yeah, in March I'll be speaking about it. But I don't have the link yet. So if you're interested, I'll just write my email on the.
Okay. You know, I think that's important for mothers all over the world. Doesn't matter, you know, where you are.
Yeah.
That you want to do your best for your child, you know.
Yeah, history of motherhood is something that has to be, well, it really has to be studied. It's an important part of our society. Thank you for asking.
All right, everyone, please do an applause or a thumbs up or a, you know. And thank you, Violeta.
Well, thank you all for listening, and I'm glad I was able to share a little bit of what I know about Chavez. And if you have any other questions, I'm willing to answer through here or through my email.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'll hang out here for a while if anybody wants to stick around, and otherwise I'll see you all next week for our lecture number 3. Yeah. Okay, good night, everyone.
Professor, I actually did have a question about
Yes,
assignment, if you have just 1 second.
I do.
So I was reading, I don't know if it's just mine, but I see what it says to do a 250 word at least synopsis and then use the code word, but it doesn't really give me a format. So I'm just wondering if you want it like chronological, if there's, I didn't really see it in modules, like it doesn't really tell me what to do. So I just want to make sure.
The purpose is really just for me to see that you were here and following along. And so whatever style you decide to do that is okay with me. Some students write it as a narrative. Other students write it as bullet points. If you can convey that to me in another way, that's fine. And,
okay.
Yeah.
Because right now my notes are like, I just did mostly notes, but it's kind of like all over the place. Like it's not in any order. So I just didn't know if you'd want me to turn it in that way or kind of, you know, spruce it up a bit.
Well, yeah, write something that, write something and not just give me your notes. Maybe take a little bit of time with it. But.
Oh, yeah, it's like 450 words. I was writing like pretty detailed. That's what I mean. I was like writing pretty detailed, like history of him, but I just did it as she was talking, so it's not like all in order, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm looking forward to reading it.
All right, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Hi, Magdalena.
Hi, I know I emailed you earlier about it. It was, I know on the the lecture 1 assignment, attendance, you gave out like 3 like links, like songs to listen to based on our last, our last name.
Mm-hmm.
So mine was the second one, but I know you sent me the links. Do I have to listen to all of them or just, one of them and then include it?
Horrors.
Just one, right?
Yes, you could just listen to the one assigned to your group, but they're all about 3-minute long excerpts. So it's not gonna, if you want to listen to all of them. I mean,
okay. So at least write about just one, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And then
Sounds
whatever
good.
you were speaking about on there.
I missed that part. What was that?
Oh, and then whatever the lecture was about, correct? That.
Yes.
And
right.
then the okay. Well, thank you so much. It's because I missed the first time, So now, I'm confused. So, but I'm glad you clarified it for me.
Yeah,
Thank you
yeah.
so much.
You're welcome. Okay.
Okay, well, everyone have a good night.
Thank you, Magdalena.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
I hear there's somebody's dog.
I got a question.
Hi, Anthony. What's your question?
So you said today was the day for the independence from Spain. And
Yeah.
okay, so Mexico was a part of Spain before I mean,
Yeah, well, just like the United States, I mean, the 13 colonies were colonized by England. We were actually colonized by Spain. Well, not we, I wasn't there, but the territory was colonized by Spain in the 16th century. So when
Okay.
Columbus found America, he didn't know he found America, but the Spanish started exploring all this territory, and there was this very important conqueror called Hernán Cortés, who came to well, not Mexico, to Tenochtitlan, which is where the Aztecs, better known as Mexicas, lived in, and he submitted them, and then this territory, which is now Mexico, became part of Spain, part of the Spanish Empire. And that lasted for 3 centuries. And in 1810, there was a independence revolution that began the September 16th of 1810, and it ended on September 23rd, I believe, 1821. So there was a 11-year-long war that freed us from, freed this area from
Spain,
Spanish
from Spain.
dominion.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's crazy to know
Which
these
is
three
why,
centuries.
yeah, which is why most of Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina, speak Spanish.
Got you.
Yeah.
So when the castle that's in Chapultepec Park, when was that built? Was that built by the Spanish? I mean, I know that.
No, that's another imperialist adventure in Mexico. Because after we became a free country, there was a lot of division between liberals and conservatives. Liberals believe that we should become a republic, an independent republic, most like the United States. But conservatives believe that we needed help from European countries because we weren't civilized enough. So we got help, or another intervention, from the French when Napoleon III was doing his empire in France, and he sent an Austrian.
The Habsburgs, right?
Yeah, the
One of the
Habsburgs. They sent
yeah.
Maximilian.
Okay.
Yeah, they sent Maximilian, and he
Yeah.
built Chapultepec as his castle.
Mm.
And
He didn't-
that's when we were another empire.
He didn't last
the
very long, did
1860s.
he? Was it?
No.
They kind of got rid of him. They
Yeah, he
dispatched him.
was killed.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, he was here for a while, and well, the conservatives didn't really get enough support. And as soon as the French started losing power in Europe, they stopped supporting Maximilian. And as soon as the Union won in the United States, they started to become worried about what was going on south of the border, and they started supporting the liberals, and Maximilian was overthrown. And that's when we have our other really big figure, Mexican figure, Benito Juárez, who was our president, triumph over the French. And that's when Cinco de Mayo comes from, because it was a battle that was won at the beginning of that intervention, a battle we won and the war we lost.
Violeta, you are so knowledgeable. It's really a pleasure to be able to throw you these, fastballs that you're just able to knock them all across the center field fence. one after the other.
Some
I
things
tried
are-
really hard to trip you up, and it didn't work. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't try that. No, but yeah, very nice. Thank you.
And thank you for the
I'm-
music too. The because you know some of those two. Well, I definitely like the feel of it.
I hope you get to listen to the full music tonight, maybe
Oh, no, I
considering
will.
it's the Mexican Independence Day, because they really are. I mean, they're nationalist anthems almost, but they're also really exciting to listen to. I mean, I really I dare you to listen to the Wapango and to the danzón without nodding your head and dancing a little
Oh, I
bit.
was.
It's
You can
almost
feel.
impossible. They're really catchy and they're really fun to listen to.
You can definitely feel that indigenous energy, and then just the
Yeah.
classical energy. I mean, you can just feel it all within what he's composing. It definitely, I like it.
Yeah. They're lots of fun to listen to.
Appreciate everything you displayed tonight.
Okay. Well, good. I think we did it.
Right.
I hope
Oh,
you had a
I'm-
good. I hope you had a good time, Violeta. We
Oh,
really
yeah,
enjoyed
yeah.
having you here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was fun talking about this, and you know, it's great to share a little bit of our Mexican culture with you.
Yeah. Well, it's it's. I would never have thought of having a guest lecture this way before COVID. But
Yeah.
the interesting thing that came out of that is that we can do this, and we could have done it before, but who really was thinking in that way, very much. So it's great to have you here, and good luck with all of your research.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
for inviting me, and good luck with the next lectures. It will be a lot of fun to listen.
I forget who we have
Next
next week. Is
lectures.
it Guadalupe? I think Guadalupe. is
Yeah.
next week.
And
I
think
I see her here too. I think she's
yeah.
there tonight. So yeah, that would be good. Well, go celebrate
Yeah.
a cerveza and maybe some more pozole.
Yeah, sure. I will. Well, thank you very much,
Oh.
and have a great night.
Okay, I'll be sending you some stuff soon for you to fill out, and
Thank
we'll
you.
go from there.
Yeah.
All right. Good.
Well, have a great evening.
Night.
Goodbye.
You said the key word was the rhubarb pie.
Rhubarb pie.
All right.
Mhm.
All right, man. Thank you. Have a good night.
Okay, you too.
All right.
Okay, good night, everyone. This is anybody has a question. Claudia, Kyra, Akash, Ramon. Everybody's good. Okay. See you next time.